Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum, Cadence independent media production. If you're new to the channel, what we do here is talk about sound and tone and functionality of drum sounds and busting myths and finding hacks and things like that. And today, I've been wanting to do this for a while. We're talking about setting up your hi-hat stand for the sort of music that you want to make and just make your life a little bit easier. So a hi-hat stand seems like a simple thing. I mean, every drum set generally, has some kind of hi-hat stand involved if you're playing, a normal sort of drum set like we have here. And there are a bunch of things on it that are adjustable. And I've noticed just meeting people from professionals on down to beginners that aren't super familiar with what the adjustments are actually going to change in terms of their playing experience. It's mostly just that it looks right, so it's right, and they leave it, and then they have frustrations with it. And a while back, we talked about bass drum pedals, kind of from a similar perspective, and just whether or not you know what's working for you and what's working against you. Thanks again to ProMark by D'Addario, our presenting sponsor, for helping us out today. So what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about basically the 4 things on a hi-hat stand that are the primary adjustability points. Some only have 3 of these, but I'm going to hit on the 4th one in case you have it too. And these are going to change the feel and behavior of the whole thing, and also to some degree the sound and the sound options that are available to you. So let's start at the top. Hi-hat clutch. The little bit that comes off holds your top cymbal. The one on here is a Remo, which I happen to like because of the construction. Most people are going to have one reminiscent of this Gibraltar right here, which is just a simple little piece, but I mean, if you've ever gotten to a gig and forgot it, you know you're in trouble, because if your hi-hat's going to hi-hat, you need one of these. Now, there's 2 sides to this thing. There is the bottom screw, which holds the cymbal on, and there are other bits above that decide how tightly the felts are holding on to the top cymbal. Now, depending on the music you're making, tight cymbals might be best for you, or loose cymbals might be best for you. I have noticed that most people I meet err on one extreme or the other. They either have them cinched down ridiculously tight, or they have them so loose that the foot reaction is a little slow because there's a lot of slop between the felts. And for me, I like to err on the loose side because it gives me a lot of options with how I'm attacking it with the stick. And it also, in my experience, prolongs the life of the hi-hat cymbals, because if they're in there really tight, you may run into stress fractures in the hole, and you may also crack the cymbal elsewhere, especially if you're playing super hard, which I have noticed often goes along with tightly held cymbals, because when you're hitting really hard, you don't want them whipping around all over the place, so people tend to cinch them down. So this isn't about what's right or wrong. This is really just me saying this is an adjustment point that you should experiment with in terms of the sound that you want. One thing that I do a lot that kind of requires a looser top cymbal to get a good sound is splashing the hi-hats with the foot. And the reason that this affects that is that they're striking each other, and if the cymbal's cinched down, you're essentially choking the top cymbal, which shortens and kind of boxes in the general sound of the foot splash. Now, moving on to adjustment number 2, which is associated with this, is how far apart are your hi-hat cymbals? I've seen them half an inch. I've seen them over a couple of inches. I've seen everything in between. And this is another situation where the way you play, the music you play, how you're using your hi-hat can affect this. If you're getting off your hi-hat stand to a double bass pedal and you still want to hit your hi-hats and have them meet each other, you can't have them that far apart. It's not going to work. So there are times to have them close and there are times to have them far. If you do a lot with your hi-hat foot and your foot also lives on that pedal 100% of the time, I encourage everyone I meet to go for a little bit wider of a span between them. And for me, I actually don't measure the span of the cymbals. What I do is I set my feet on the 2 pedals and I depress the bass drum beater against the bass drum, and then I adjust the hi-hat clutch so that when both of my feet are pressed down, they're the same height. if you notice that your hi-hat foot is higher than your bass drum foot when both of them are pressed down, try adjusting them to the same. It's actually going to change your balance. It's going to change your feel on everything. And you might find a sound that you like somewhere in having these kind of wider options in terms of just opening the hi-hat. A nice side effect of it too, if you're a person like me who often does gigs with one cymbal, is if they're wide enough apart, you can actually use the top cymbal as a crash without it necessarily colliding with the bottom cymbal. And you can even do mallet swells on it, which is super fun too, because a lot of times hi-hat cymbals have a really unusual sound, because we're not used to hearing them alone like that. So it can be another kind of color for your palette. Number 3, how high are the cymbals together set on the stand? This is, again, another thing that affects the sounds you get and the options you have, but it also can be specific to the style that you're playing. If you watch videos of Elvin Jones, his hi-hats are often almost parallel with his snare drum because he's not playing beats on the top of the hi-hat very much. He's using them almost exclusively with his foot. And then on another hand, like if you check out like Travis Barker, you've got a big differential because he's playing extremely hard with both hands, so you don't want them running into each other when you're trying to do a groove. At the end of the day, as long as you're able to get everything you need out of the height that you're set at, you're good to go. But if they're too low, you're stuck with what's on top. And if they're too high, it's difficult to get on top and you'll end up on the edge a lot. So for me, I think a comfortable height is basically where I can get a shank on the edge easily without running into the snare drum, and where I can also play with the tip on top without feeling like I'm reaching up into the sky. Another thing that can affect the functional height of your hi-hat for you is whether you play traditional grip or matched grip. I've noticed that some other people's setups are difficult for me to play on because I play traditional grip like 99% of the time. And that's just another thing to take into consideration. You can get away with different things depending on your posture and your grip and all these different kind of variables. Primary thing number 4 is the spring tension of the hi-hat. Now, if you look at a hi-hat stand, you wouldn't necessarily realize that there's even a spring in here, but there is a spring inside at the bottom that decides how difficult it is to press down the pedal, and then conversely, how quickly the cymbals come back up when you take your foot off. Now, this is the one I mentioned where not all stands have this, and you don't necessarily need it, but if you go between different weights of hi-hat cymbals, especially if they're dramatically different, like between really thin ones and then like really heavy rock ones, you'll notice that the thin ones snap back really fast and the heavier ones feel kind of sluggish. So this is something that needs to be thought about if you have this adjustment in terms of the cymbals that you're using, firstly, and then secondly, what kind of behavior do you like? Do you like a lot of pushback from the pedal, or do you like it to be sort of slow and have a little bit more of like a tactile feeling between the cymbals with your foot? This is mostly a foot-oriented experience for the hi-hat. And if you're especially someone who's moving into trying to use the hi-hat with your foot more in your playing, this is a thing to check out and to just fuss with, same as with the spring tension on your bass drum pedal. No one of them is right, and every music can call for something slightly different. But, you know, I stick with kind of the same thing, which for me is between loose and all the way loose. This is a DW 7000 stand that I've had for 12 years, and I set the tension when I got it with, what cymbals were they? I think they were 15-inch like AKG hats, so they weren't razor thin, but they were on the thin side. I loosened it as far as it would go, and I was happy, and I've never changed it, except for one time when I was at a recording session and I forgot my hi-hats, and I had to use the house cymbals, which were Dynabeats, and they were real heavy, and I had to cinch it down because it actually wouldn't pick up the top cymbal. I took my foot off, and it just sat there. So there you go. Something to think about that's pretty important. There's one more that isn't a primary functionality thing, but it is very important to me, and it's the part of the hi-hat that I've noticed that an awful lot of people don't actually know what it's for. And pardon me if you know, this is for the folks that are unaware of this function, or at least like what it does. And that is the little bolt underneath the bottom hi-hat cymbal. There will be sometimes a sort of vertical bolt, or in the case of this one, a wing nut on a lateral bolt. And the function of this is to tip the big felt underneath the bottom cymbal at an angle, so that if you look straight on at the side of the hi-hats, the bottom one is at an angle and the top one is flat. And so when they meet, They kind of do that. And this is not that different than the way that orchestral or marching percussionists will use two cymbals. You don't slam them flat together. There's a slight angle for the meeting, and this has to do with the fact that you're trapping air inside of the cymbals when you slam them together. And that can result in almost like a phase cancellation kind of effect when you're using your foot to hit them together. Again, something that may not have occurred to you if you're a person who doesn't necessarily use your foot on the hi-hat that much. But when you start to do that, you'll notice that sometimes you'll have a nice click, chip, whatever you want to call that sound, and other times it'll sound kind of fluffy, like almost like the cymbals are exhaling or something like that. People have done things like drilling holes in the bottom cymbals before. I've seen that a few times. There are other things to do, but ultimately, this is about making sure that you get a good foot sound. And there is a change in the stick sound as well, but it's less dramatic than the foot sound. Also, as you saw earlier with the foot splashing, having an angled bottom cymbal is going to accentuate the sound of the foot splash in the same way as marching cymbals and orchestral cymbals, that kind of thing. So I always kick the bottom cymbal at an angle because I like the behavior of it. It's not mandatory, but just so you know, that's why it's there, that's what it's for, and it may benefit you to check it out and try out some different adjustments for that. Last thing, it's not exactly an adjustment per se, but it's something that I've noticed that beyond just sort of being kind of an odd thing to do or an odd choice is adjusting the legs of the hi-hat to where the foot at the bottom of the straight part is actually not on the ground. It's off the ground, so the 3 feet of the hi-hat are resting on the ground, but the center post is not touching. I'm not totally sure what the motivation is behind this, other than that I think that some people consider it to be adding stability rather than having everything rock around the center. But this, aside from changing the angle that you're attacking the pedal at, it's going to shorten the life of your hi-hat stand, because every time you stomp on it, you're rocking that bass point around that's meant to be sitting on the floor. And this is exceptionally true of stands that have 2 legs and then the foot plate is the 3rd leg, because that's just held together with screws, and that middle thing needs to be on the ground. And if it's not on the ground, you're stressing all of these spots that can't carry the weight of a leg slamming down on it all the time. If that's something you notice when you look at your hi-hat stand, consider getting it as close to the ground as is comfortable for you, while still making sure that it's not going to run away when you play. And it's really going to help you to not have to buy that stand again. And for me, it actually is more difficult to play with a steeply angled pedal on a hi-hat stand anyway, because your foot isn't really meant to go like that. So just something to think about. It is definitely rampant. So have a look at yours and see, what your preferred thing is, and try changing it up a little bit, see what happens. There are a few other things you might see on a hi-hat stand, depending on the kind of like construction of it, the sort of level of it, whether it's beginner or like super heavy-duty touring stuff, that aren't really primary functionality things, but they're things to know. First of all, a lot of them have memory locks on them now, and sometimes you need memory locks, sometimes you don't. But there's something you're going to run into, particularly on the center post, to keep the cymbals from gradually working their way down as you play with your foot and with your hands. And if you're experiencing anything like that, you should check out memory locks if they're on your stand. And if they're not on your stand, there are aftermarket things. I've seen people use hose clamps from the hardware store for this purpose, to just make sure that everything stays where it's supposed to be. There can also be spikes on the feet that are adjustable or not adjustable. As I said before, some have 2 legs and then a stiff bass plate for the pedal. Others have 3 legs and a folding bass plate like this one. The variables are just ridiculous. As long as it works, as long as it does the job of a hi-hat stand, it's all good. So whatever you may have, chances are it'll be slightly different than what I have. Bends are slightly different than mine. And they are meant to be fairly universal. It's a hi-hat stand, so get into these adjustments. Don't be afraid to try things. There's no right or wrong with this stuff as long as it does what you need and you're not getting stuck or hung up anywhere. As a perfect example, today when we were playing earlier, I was trying to play some really fast stuff on the bass drum, and I noticed that, if I tightened the spring up a whole bunch, it made it easier, and I've always thought of myself as a loose spring person. This worked today, and that was a big surprise to me, and I still don't know how to feel about it. but that's the type of thing. Like, we're we're doing that here too. We're still being surprised. All of the playing that we did today for this video was inspired by this drum because it made a certain kind of sound. It made me think of James Gadson and Billy Martin and people, and I couldn't just play like, you know, a rock groove on it. It had to be these other things, you know. Just remember that that's the point of all of this, is playing well, playing easily, making music, and a hi-hat stand is just a tool. It's a means to an end. But know your tools. Also, just a side note, a lot of people have been asking for a while now if and when we're going to get into cymbals, and this is sort of touching right up against that barrier. We're going to do it, and it's going to be a thing. It's going to be a long-winded, very in-depth thing that will exist on our Patreon because we really want the opportunity to go as deep as possible. This is going to include interviews with other people, maybe even cymbal makers, maybe even some drummers that have really specific preferences in their cymbals, including myself, but also other people we know. And we really want to make sure that we can go as far as possible with it. So keep an eye on the Patreon. Go over there and check it out if you get an opportunity, because that's where it's going to be. And a lot of our kind of deep dives outside of tone and sound production are going to live over there. All right, guys, if you made it to the end, thanks very much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell at the bottom there so that you can get a little notification when we put up a new video. We always post on Tuesday at 12:30 Eastern Time. So if you don't get a notification, there is a video. And please let us know if you have any thoughts about hi-hat stands. They are super fun. There's a lot of things that go on with them. I've had this one forever. It's really funny to think about, you know, to have a relationship with a stand like that that's, you know, seen a lot of gigs and a lot of shows. Of course, thanks again to ProMart by D'Addario for being our presenting sponsor and helping us out today. And yeah, that's about it. Go check out your hi-hats.